In terms of today's program, I was told by the speaker I have 30 seconds to introduce him. No, he said I can't speak any more than that, which is really kind of an impossibility to introduce a man of Peter Kern's background and stature. But when we think about Prohibition, you know, it's the interesting thing about Prohibition is everybody knows something about it. When I think of Prohibition, I think of Al Capone. I had a friend of mine that used to have a farm. He's passed away a long time ago now, and he said he paid for that farm with Prohibition money. And then he used to sell in the black market, and they used to make stuff, and I mean, it's all true. And he said he was so afraid of going to prison for his entire life that he ultimately had a nervous breakdown from it. And he said, so the farm really wasn't worth it. I should have got a real job and earned a damn thing. But, you know, sometimes crime, people think it pays, it never does. Certainly didn't pay for Al Capone. Actually doesn't pay for anybody, I don't think. So, in introducing today's speaker, Peter Kern is really a man of profound intellectual background. I mean, he's been the president of a hospital. That in itself is quite a responsibility. He was a senior vice president for the New Jersey Zinc Company, running the big zinc mine in Ogdensburg, New Jersey, which ultimately he was presiding over when it closed down, and the stories that he has with that. He has advanced degrees in chemical engineering, knows a lot about just about everything. There's nothing I can ever bring up that he doesn't know more of than I do. Of course, there are history topics that I hope I know more than he does, but he is extremely knowledgeable. He truly is an intellectual. His wife, Carol, runs the public library up in Broadheadsville. In fact, in many ways, the two of them created the library. They usually spend their weekends at Barnegat. And so the fact is, can you imagine, they gave up a weekend at Barnegat Bay and at sunset tonight so they could be here with us. That in itself is worth a round of applause. Maybe we could give them that right now, huh? Because I said to them, you know, like, what are you going to do? You know, I mean, that's the truth. And they showed me the picture they took last weekend at Barnegat, and I felt so bad that, okay, well, you're here, Peter, I'm sorry, but you can put that on, or go on YouTube tonight or something. But in either case, Prohibition is really interesting because it seems to me like everything's being liberalized today. I mean, I grew up where you wouldn't even want to be around marijuana, and if anybody, you know, had it, it was like you expected the police to break the door down. Now it's like, you know, people use it with impunity around here, and nobody gives a second thought about it. Alcohol has, you know, now they say it's good for you, and I know exactly. It's actually, wine is good for you. 1 or 2 drinks a day will prolong your health. And a doctor friend of mine told me recently, he said, Joe, the truth of the matter is there's no level of alcohol that's safe, period. What does that tell you? But they have a study for everything. On Monday, meat was bad for you. On Tuesday, it was good. So you wonder why we're so darn confused. Anyway, we're hoping that by the end of today, you are no longer confused about Prohibition. I believe that Peter Kern will lay this out in a very judicious way. I learned a lot just from him telling me what he was going to talk about. I remember when I went in the Army, I didn't know anything about drinking. I didn't know really anything about beer. And they said, well, the only thing we drink around here is 3-2 beer. And I said, what is that? Well, it's low alcohol. The Army doesn't want us to get drunk too quick. That's what they said. And of course, the military gives you all the alcohol you ever wanted. There's no doubt about that. And I was in Germany at the time, so they rationed it because they knew we were going to sell it. But in either case, I learned real quick that, you know, drinking could be fun. As long as you do it in moderation. So with that, let's give Peter Kern a nice round of applause as he inspires our thoughts and ideas and takes us back to the era of Prohibition as we learn everything about it. Peter, why don't you come on up here? Thank you so much for being here.
Can you hear me? Yes. Good, because I'm going to walk around. My wife lost the over-under. I won it. I said we'd have full house. She said, I don't think so. Too nice a day. I said, well, I'm surprised. Thanks for coming out. I appreciate that you're all here. I'm going to talk about the noble experiment, a subject that I know nothing about. And frankly, Joe said I told him about it. I didn't. All I told him about was 3.2 here. That's the only thing he remembered. Because I didn't tell him where I was going today. I'm not Ken Burns. That's up front, I'm going to say that. So if you're expecting a Ken Burns presentation, I hope you're not disappointed. The noble experiment is a subject that I really don't know anything about. In fact, the ancient Greeks had an adage that they gave to their orators. They said, if you don't know what you're talking about, just make it a little bit more difficult and nobody will notice. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the noble experiment. And if you go online and Google it, it's interesting. The noble experiment was undertaken to reduce crime and corruption, solve social problems, reduce the tax burden created by prisons and poorhouses, and improve health and hygiene in America. Sounds good, doesn't it? Well, Joe said, I'd like to have a title for this presentation. So I said, well, how does this one sound? Prohibition, America's attempt to legislate morality. I really like the second one better. It's really all about the money. Keep that in mind. Keep that in mind. The noble experiment, a lot of people think it was 1919. It really wasn't. You know when the noble experiment took place? When did it take place? 1776. We started the noble experiment here on July 4th, 1776. And we're in the midst of the Revolutionary War. We adopted the Articles of Confederation. So now you see where I'm going. I'm starting off and I'm going to work towards 1919. So be patient with me. The Articles of Confederation were adopted in 1781. States remained sovereign. There was really no strong federal government. Congress is only the last resort to settle disputes. There was no taxing authority. That's key right there. A weak central government, and it required the approval by all 13 colonies. You couldn't do anything unless you got all 13 to agree to it. What was the purpose? The purpose was to keep the Revolutionary War going. We were in the middle of a war, 1781. We were looking forward with optimism that we would prevail, and the purpose of the Articles of Confederation was to get us there. Now we fast forward to 1787. We go to the Constitution, United States Constitution. What they did was they said, the Articles of Confederation aren't working, let's get together and amend them. Now, how did you amend the Articles of Confederation? Well, you needed 13 people, 13 states, 13 colonies at that point, to agree. Well, they only sent 2 delegations to this convention. So how could you get unanimous approval when only 2 of them showed up? So they scrapped the whole thing and said, hey, let's start over from scratch. Let's start over in 1787 and create a constitution. Now, what is the Constitution of the United States? It's the bylaws under which we operate. It was created in 1787. It was ratified in 1788. It became effective in 1789. It followed a failed attempt to modify or amend the Articles of Confederation to remedy the deficiencies of a weak central government. This was the problem. They gave all the power to the states, the individual colonies, and nothing to the federal government. The Constitution pitted the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Who were they? Well, you had states' rights people, and you had people who wanted a strong central government. Hamilton wanted a strong central government. People like Jefferson wanted states' rights. So they had to come up with a compromise. The states' rights people said, we're not going to approve this Constitution unless, and what was the big unless? Anybody know what it was?
Slavery.
Bill of Rights.
Bill of Rights. Bill of Rights. We're not going to approve it unless you pass the Bill of Rights. Now, I put up, you're only going to see 2 pictures, by the way. This is one of them, so get used to the fact that you're not going to see much more. Does anybody know who Frederick Augustus Conrad Muhlenberg was?
First Speaker of the House.
Say again?
First Speaker of the House.
First Speaker of the House of Representatives. First Speaker of the House of Representatives. Pennsylvania Lutheran minister. It didn't found Muhlenberg College. There were a ton of Muhlenbergs. It must have been like Smith around there. Anyway, he was very impressive. He was very impressive. He kept German from becoming an official language of the United States. They wanted that German was so popular and so common in the early years of the United States that a lot of people wanted it to become another official language in addition to English. Sound familiar? Sound familiar like what we're going through today? This is what he said. The faster the Germans become Americans, the better it will be. Does that sound familiar? I mean, 200 years go by, times don't change. Times don't change. We had the Bill of Rights. So we had 10 amendments to the Constitution. And these were the compromise that the states' rights people exacted from the Constitutional Convention so that they would approve it. And I'm just going to zip through these. It was put forth for ratification in 1789 by John Adams, who was the president of the Senate, and our friend Frederick Augustus Conrad Muhlenberg. I love the name. Frederick Augustus Conrad Muhlenberg, first Speaker of the House. This is the preamble, which is worth just taking a quick look at. The conventions of a number of states having at the time of adopting the Constitution expressed a desire in order to prevent misconstruction or abuse of its powers that further declaratory and restrictive clauses should be added. A lot of people said, well, Madison, who was a Federalist at the time, Hamilton, said, you don't need that. The Constitution is fine. Trust us. We'll do it right. Trust us. And Jefferson said, and others said, sorry, but we need something a little bit more concrete. So they put in the various amendments. Amendment number 1, and I'm going to zip through these because that's not the ones. The one I'm interested in is number 10. Does anybody know what number 10 says? You'll find out. You'll find out. This is the one that we hear. The one that we hear the most about today, obviously, is the freedom of speech. Freedom of speech. Then obviously number 2 with the gun issue, which is number 2. Number 3, you can't quarter soldiers in your house. The right of the people to be secure in their persons. I mean, these are all, shall I say, relevant issues to the people during the Revolutionary War period and immediately thereafter. Well, we get up to number 6. Number 6, the accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy trial. Number 5, by the way, we all know what that is. You know, that's the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution against self-incrimination. And then number 7, this is interesting. It says, in suits at common law where the value in controversy shall exceed $20, the right to trial by jury shall be preserved. The $20 is amusing. By the way, it's still valid today, except you can just delete the words $20. In the common law, the right to trial by jury shall be preserved. That's basically what it's been reduced to today. Excessive bail shall not be required. The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others. That's kind of the escape clause. Number 10, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. Why is this important? Well, you couldn't have the 18th Amendment to the Constitution because it said the states have that right. The states have the right to control. So unless you made a change in the Constitution, you were not going to have universal prohibition in the United States. Now this was ratified in 1791. It's interesting that it took 10 states to ratify it because between the time it was submitted and the time it was ratified, they had added another state. 13 had become 14. There were originally 12 amendments. Originally 12 amendments. 2 of them were omitted after failing to pass. One of them became the 27th Amendment. It took 200 years. You know, that one, does anybody know what the 27th Amendment is? It has to do with pay for the senators and representatives. It says their pay cannot be increased until there has been an election in between. In other words, if they set their pay this year, they have to wait until there's another congressional election before it becomes effective. It took 200 years to get that one, but the other one involved the size of electoral districts, and had it been approved, we would today have over 6,000 members in the House. I mean, these are, again, these two were not adopted at the time. Now, the United States Constitution is short, relatively speaking. It's short, and it should be. It's 4,400 words. Of course, we have a lot of regulatory verbosity in there that takes it. And it was a collective effort. It was not the work of just 1 or 2 brilliant men. Of course, if you looked at it, it was men. It was a men's only club. Sorry, ladies, but they could have used some of the ladies there. I think they would have been much more effective. The life of the Constitution. They say by the way, if you go back 4,400 words, the Constitution of India is 115,000 words. So maybe we're fortunate. It is only 4,400 words. Of course, the Supreme Court's the one that always has to fight with what it means today. So let's just talk about that for a moment. The University of Chicago did a study that said that the average national constitution of countries throughout the world lasts less than 20 years before they revise it entirely. Now ours is 220 years old. Is it good? Is it bad? Most individual states require periodic constitutional reevaluation. Why am I going through this? Why am I going through this when we want to get to the 18th? Everybody said, what about Prohibition? There's nothing about Prohibition here. But unless you understand why we had to go through Prohibition, why we had to go through the pain of prohibiting the use of alcohol for 14 years in the United States and finding out that the noble experiment really wasn't that noble. The average constitution, in state constitutions are revised every 10, 20 years. Does the process of amending a constitution become too much a part of the fabric of the underlying document? In other words, you take the document, now you've got 27 amendments. If they were to redo the Constitution today, you'd start off with 0 amendments. But they would probably incorporate in the Constitution many of the items that we have, with the exception of the 18th Amendment, and the 21st, you wouldn't need them. Just remember, how does all this tie in with the subject? Well, I'm getting there, folks. I'm getting there. I'm getting there. It's all about the money. Why? Anybody know why it's all about the money? I heard taxation. The roots of Prohibition were present at least 100 years earlier than the 18th Amendment. If you go back to 1826, you had the American Temperance Society. You had the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the Anti-Saloon League. It flourished in the early 1800s, the late 1800s, and the early 1900s. We wanted to get rid of all of the ills that were associated with alcohol. Just remember, you get the word alcohol, you can substitute a number of other things in there. Massachusetts passed a law back in 1657, making the sale of liquor to Indians illegal. Why? They knew that it wasn't good, so they made it illegal. And by 1916, half the states in the Union had laws in some form prohibiting the sale or manufacture of alcohol. Then why did we need the 18th Amendment? Half of the states had laws controlling it. Why was the consumption of alcohol tolerated for so long when there was so much opposition? It's true. It's true. In the early 20th century, 30 to 40% of federal tax revenue came from alcohol taxes. Hard to believe. Hard to believe. And think about what's happening today. I'm not going to get into the morality of it. I'm not going to pass judgment whether drinking is good or whether drinking is bad. Whether marijuana is good, whether marijuana is bad. Whether gambling is good or gambling is bad. If it's taxable, the government will tolerate it. U.S. attempted an income tax in 1894. It was struck down by the Supreme Court. Why? I've got some copies of the Constitution over here if you want to look it up. It says you cannot impose a tax on individuals. It's in the Constitution. They were very particular about that when they wrote the Constitution because of all the tax issues that took place just prior to the Revolutionary War. So they tried in 1894 to put in an income tax. It failed. So what enabled the passing of the 18th Amendment? The 18th Amendment is the Prohibition. How did we get the Prohibition? The 16th Amendment, 4 years earlier. 16th Amendment said, Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived. There it is. They said, voila. Now we have the tools now. It was proposed in 1909. It was passed by 42 states and became law in 1913. 6 states did not ratify it. Connecticut, Florida, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, Utah, and Virginia. It didn't make any difference. All they needed was, how many states had to ratify it?
Three-quarters.
How many was that?
Three-quarters of whatever the number
Good. How many? 3/4 of 48, 36. There were only 48 states at that time. It was after 1912. The last 2 states came in 1912. They were
Arizona
and
Mexico.
They came in 1912. So we had to have 36 states, and they finally got it. Eventually, 6 states did not ratify it, as listed here. Now Congress can attempt to legislate morality with the 18th Amendment. They have the tools. They have the income tax. They don't need the tax on alcohol anymore. So the 18th Amendment gets passed. Now only a lawyer could write this. After 1 year from the ratification of this article, the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors within, the importation thereof into, or the exportation thereof from the United States and all the territories subject to the jurisdiction thereof for beverage purposes is hereby prohibited. That's it, in a nutshell. That's section 1. Section 2 is Congress and several states shall have the power to enforce it, and the article shall be inoperative unless it shall have been ratified as an amendment to the Constitution by the legislatures of the several states as provided in the Constitution. And this is a key, within 7 years from the date of the submission. It's the first time they put a date on an amendment. As I said, there's some that are still out. There were some that they're still looking for 2 or 3 states to amend, to approve before they become law. But it's interesting, they put that on. In fact, I think it was a challenge to the Supreme Court because of the putting on the 7 years, but it didn't make any difference. It was proposed by the Senate, passed 65 to 20, so it had a lot of support. Passed by the House 282 to 128, and reaffirmed by the Senate on December 18th by a vote of 47 to 8. I have to give Woodrow Wilson some credit. He vetoed it, and within about 45 minutes, they overrode the veto. So there was a tremendous amount of support for this. Even though Wilson did veto it, it did pass, and it went to the various states for approval. The first state to approve it was Mississippi. Again, that was a month later, and then the 36th state was Nebraska, which was about a year later. So we're in 1919, now it became effective 1 year after. It was rejected by 2 states, Connecticut and Rhode Island. I think if you go back, I think we're fine. Connecticut and Rhode Island, yeah, they were there too. There they are. They seem to be either slow or they don't like change. So, how did we implement it? This was the amendment, but you had to have the law. You needed a law to implement it. It was called the Volstead Act. There is Andrew John Volstead, representative. He was the judiciary chairman. Was from Minnesota. It was his committee that passed the legislation that implemented the 18th Amendment. Anything that had more than 0.5% alcohol, 0.5%. Beer, wine, liquor. People were very concerned because they only thought it was going to be liquor. Originally, they thought it was going to be liquor because everybody, my grandfather had grapevines in the backyard, and he would make his own wine. A lot of people made their own beverages, but this was basically, it said anything over 0.5% alcohol was under the control of this act. Ironically, it did not prohibit consumption. Drinking wasn't illegal. So if you could get your hands on it, it wasn't illegal. So there's an irony there. It lasted till 1933. It lasted for 14 years. Why? What was that? Can you read that up there? There it is. It's all about the money. Still, 1933. Why all of a sudden did the attitude change? Well, there were several reasons, but not the least of which was
The Great
we were in
Depression.
the middle of the Depression. The income tax the income tax was, I don't want to say it wasn't important, but it certainly didn't have the impact that it had 15 years or 13 years before. So it was about the money. We'll get this solved by repealing the 18th Amendment, which they did. They repealed it, again, going back with the 21st Amendment. The first state was Michigan. It took less than a year to repeal it. I think there was a kind of a groundswell. It was rejected or no action. If you notice, the states that Connecticut and Rhode Island, they're not here. Somehow or other. But if you notice, most of these are, I don't want to call them red states, but most of them are red states: South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, Kansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Nebraska, North Dakota, Oklahoma, and South Dakota. They either rejected it or took no action on it. Again, it's all about the money. We now have 27 amendments to the Constitution. 27. Was the 18th Amendment prudent? I'm going to leave that up for discussion. I think it's a question that we can answer today in many ways. Should we have amendments to eliminate all kinds of vices? Should we? Should we attempt to legislate morality? Smoking? Should we have a law saying it's illegal to transport into a state or to sell in a state? See, the problem was, remember, it was the 10th Amendment that left all these rights to the states. States can regulate them. States can regulate marriage laws. States can regulate drinking ages. If the government gets involved where it covers the entire country, then they need an amendment. So should we have an amendment controlling smoking or marijuana? You asked me, we're going to talk about marijuana. This young lady asked me, we're going to talk about marijuana. There it is. It's up there. I'm not going to pass judgment on it, pro or con. Anybody that says marijuana is good because it has medicinal values, that's yet to be proven. It's all about the money. Gambling, prostitution. Should we have amendments? Do you think we should have federal amendments to control these? How about sugary soft drinks or family donuts? No, we laugh. We laugh. Philadelphia's got it. Philadelphia charges you extra money now for soft drinks. You know, do we see this as a possibility for the future? I don't know. Should these be the subject of amendments? I think the 18th Amendment was ill-conceived. I think it was a response. It was well-intentioned, perhaps. It was well-intentioned because, as I said before, it was designed in the hope of eliminating some of the ills of society. Did they eliminate murders skyrocketed. During the 14 years, murder rates were up by over 40%. Deaths from bootleg alcohol skyrocketed. Did it solve the problem? No. It just created, it's the unintended consequences. It's the unintended consequences. So, we're often frustrated by the inaction of government. Is it good that the government moves? The mills of the government grind slowly. Sometimes we get frustrated by that. Sometimes we wish they would go a little bit faster. I'm not sure that we want to be having knee-jerk reactions every time there is an issue. So I'll leave that as a question. I'm going to leave it at this point and say, if you have any comments or questions, I'd be happy to be a moderator, but I'm not going to be an adjudicator. By the way, are any lawyers here? I hope not.
We don't allow lawyers to be.
No, you don't allow lawyers. Good, okay. Thank you, Joe. I appreciate that. No, seriously, it is an issue that is we're confronting today. Times change, but really they don't change that much. It's just the words that change. We look at gambling. Years ago, if you wanted to gamble, you went to Nevada. Not Nevada, you went to Nevada. They like Nevada out there. They don't like Nevada. So you went to Nevada if you wanted to gamble. Then Atlantic City came along. Now, every street corner has got the ability to gamble. Is that good or bad? It's all about the money. It's about the money. Where the government has realized that they can't legislate morality. And anytime they try to do that, they generally create a problem bigger than the one that they're trying to solve. So rather than legislate it, they try to regulate it. And there's a difference. There's a difference. The regulations involve laws, there's no question about it. But they're generally much more specific and they're more carefully crafted than just a general amendment that says all alcohol is going to be banned. So the question is, when you go back to things like this, is it best that we regulate them? Should we regulate Juul cigarettes, for example? E-cigarettes? Should the government have been a little bit more proactive, shall I say, when it came to the fact that they were looking the other way when they were approving a drug delivery device, which really, an electronic cigarette is nothing more than a drug delivery device. It's nicotine. Instead of smoking tobacco, you inhale nicotine directly. So, I mean, these are questions. I'm not getting into answers, I'm getting into questions. But whenever we try to legislate people's morality, we find that there are differences. There are shades of gray, and it's very difficult to do that. So I will leave you with this question. I think the 18th Amendment was ill-conceived, and we're often frustrated by the inaction of government. I don't know how we can change that. But the question comes back to an earlier one that was up there, and that is, should we have another constitutional convention? Or is that noble experiment that we created back in 1776, and with the Constitution that was later approved in 1787, is that the reason why we are still looked up to throughout the world as being one of the great leaders of the world? I'm not talking about individuals, I'm not talking about one-on-one, I'm talking about the country as a whole. We're still looked upon as one of the leaders, and maybe the reason for that is because we had such, shall I say, intellects back in the 1780s when they crafted the Constitution. They did follow the English system to a great extent. They did make some important changes. One of the failures that it did have was the 18th Amendment. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Now, Peter's going to entertain your questions. And I tell you, I would really be interested, we would be interested in hearing what all of you have to say. And he's going to be passing out copies of the Constitution. By the way, are you going to announce you're running for Congress soon or anything like that?
No, this is from actually, I only have 20 copies. So
we've got a few more to back you up here.
Yeah. I have 20 copies of the Pennsylvania Bar Association put this together. So if anybody doesn't have and would like to have a copy of the Constitution and the various amendments to it, I do have copies up here, so feel free
And if
to stop up and pick a copy up.
Yeah, if he runs out, we've got other ones. But I think it would be interesting to hear what all of you think about this, only because you look at Prohibition, it does seem like, to me, like we've opened the floodgates to everything. If the government can get some kind of revenue out of it, it's good. Or I shouldn't say it's good, it's approved anyway, or it seems to be approved. It is interesting to me, maybe it doesn't mean anything, that we changed it from marijuana to cannabis now. I don't know if that was intentional, but it seems to go down much easier as cannabis. You know, I hate to say this, but one of the things that we think in the world of history all the time is that we've gotten down to talking points. Daniel Worston, the Library of Congress, wrote a book 50 years ago and said that we understand now how to manipulate everybody. And he started, let's say, with the presidential debates of Kennedy and Nixon. And essentially what he said is, you know, we have talking points, you see the television. How about that old song, Simon and Garfunkel, a man hears what he wants to hear and disregards the rest. So it's getting to be, to me, hard to figure out what's true and what's real and what just looks like it is. I mean, how could marijuana be bad for so many years and now it's all of a sudden good? Maybe it is good, I don't know, like he says. We'd like to hear what you all have to say because this is America right here. You tell us what you think. And Peter can entertain any question you have. Does anybody, listen, we've got some pretty smart people here, don't be afraid. I know we do have a few lawyers. They were afraid to raise their hands.
So I tried to stay away from the real legal.
We'd like to hear the British perspective. Can you stand up and tell us what you think's going on?
Well, I mean, ever since I watched Ken Burns' special a few months or 3 years ago, I was fascinated by the ramifications of the Great Experiment. Okay? I've been reading since my retirement, trying to understand what the hell the English-speaking peoples did from about the middle of the 16th century, 17th century onwards. And you've made a wonderful case, obviously. This is all associated with the dog. One book that I read about the colonization, or the habitation of the Appalachian backcountry suggested that when those wonderful people, the Scots-Irish, and followed by the renegades from the Battle of Culloden in 1745. When they disembarked at Philadelphia, they were told, well, where's all this free land we've been hearing about? And everyone said, well, just keep moving westwards and hang a left when you get to Harrisburg and keep moving down. Well, they found all this wonderful land there. I mean, that it just was the land they'd been living on in Northern Ireland, what is geographically Northern Ireland, and the Scottish lowlands were pretty nasty land, and this was all great stuff. But they had a problem. They could grow the crops, but in the absence of any transportation system, they couldn't move the crops. So they went back to one of their time-honored skills, which was of brewing a really good quality usquebae, and put the bottles on either side of the mule train and started to sell a high-quality luxury good to everybody. So there was a unique aspect to what was going on in the whole world at this time. I mean, I've always been puzzled by the fact, was it just early Americans ipso facto were great boozers to compare with their European cousins? And I don't think that's so. At least I don't know any evidence for it.
Well, again, I'm not an expert in distilling spirits, but obviously the fact that corn and other grains were available here, I would guess that potatoes was still probably one of the staples in Europe, and that could be distilled as well. But I think it was perhaps it was a matter of trying to find out what else to do with that excess corn and wheat and rye that you had. But you're right, to a certain extent, it became at first a cottage industry, and then a much more structured industry. But even if you go down to Kentucky today, and you see the individual distilleries, there still is that sense of mom and pop type of operations. They're not that small, but they still claim to be have their roots in that mom and pop type of organization. So I think you're right. Yes, sir.
First, I'd like to admit that I'm a disbarred lawyer at the firm of Peter, Madam, and Screw. Of the four things that you listed there, should we try to regulate them? The problem I have with marijuana/cannabis is that it's an entry level to worse things. Whereas you could look at cigarettes, alcohol, and prostitution and just say, well, they would consume more of the same. But the marijuana really bothers me, and how young people say, oh, I can control it. The next thing they're looking for a bigger high, and it leads to heroin or cocaine or whatever.
You don't have to go further afield than to look at the opioid crisis today, which had its roots in well-intentioned control of pain. The question always is abuse, and we look to the government to really make regulations that are both fair, balanced, and enforceable. There's no point if they make a regulation. For example, right after the 18th Amendment was passed, I mean, there were like 4,000 arrests made in New York for violating the Volstead Act. And nobody went to jail. Nobody was imprisoned. I mean, it had no teeth because it really lacked the, shall I say, the peers convicting people and sending them to jail. The jury of their peers oftentimes agreed with them, or at least shared the same type of weaknesses that they had. So it was difficult to get a jury of 12 peers together to convict somebody of something that they themselves were doing. So I think a lot of this was never really thought through when they passed the 18th Amendment. So, ma'am.
I think besides the obvious, the money
Yes.
is what you are talking about. The trouble with all of these, if you were to have laws for all morality problems, is public disobedience. How much public disobedience can a country sustain before the laws become
Irrelevant.
at least weakened
Yeah.
and not trusted and then laughed at? And once the public citizen starts laughing at the law and deliberately and publicly disobeying it, you have lost your morality right there in the discussion of what the government can legally control. They can't control what you think.
That's a very
Well,
astute
I
observation.
was going to say the same thing.
Let's give that
You nailed it. Oh, now we got to have a rebuttal?
I'm not sure when the first act that taxed liquor occurred. But in the 1790s, my family was affected by it because they grew crops west of the Alleghenies, and it was much easier to turn it into alcohol and ship it down to Mississippi than it was to ship it back east where most of the population was to eat it. And that's the first time the federal government used the federal troops to enforce taxes on liquor. And that became one of the original issues when it comes to legislating liquor and taxing it. And I thought I'd just add that to it.
Oh, I appreciate that. Can you imagine today if 40% of the federal budget was dependent upon alcohol taxes. I mean, a bottle of scotch might cost you about $2,000-3,000. And it'll all be taxes. But any others? Thank you very much. You say Western Pennsylvania. You trace your roots all the way back to the frontier.
Yeah, 1790s.
Wow.
When Washington himself sent troops to Pennsylvania, it took a long time to Pittsburgh. It took a long time to get there to enforce the Liquor Act. And that was the first taxation I'm aware of.
Going once?
You hear these polls today all the time that the majority of Americans are for liberalization of marijuana laws and that we should have it where we can openly buy it for recreational use. I don't know, it'd be interesting to see, nobody has to raise their hands here, I don't want to embarrass anybody, but how many people really think this is a good idea? Because I think that gentleman back here who said that it leads to something even greater, that's what we were taught when I was in the Army. They would come in with dogs at night. And they would wake us up at 3 o'clock in the morning and bring these dogs through. If anybody had marijuana, you were going to jail. And you were going, your military career was probably shot. But today, we see people openly walk around towns, you can tell they're smoking marijuana. We have people actually come into the museum. There were a group of students just a few weeks ago, and I could smell it from being in the Army. I've never used it, I can't. No, really. I'm not like Bill Clinton. But the truth of the matter is, what were you going to say?
Well,
Once you stand up, everybody can hear you.
as you keep saying, it's all about the money. What were we doing? We, as a society, we said it was wrong, but we were incarcerating them. And the cost of prisons and the cost of nothing being done in treatment-wise in the prisons, people would come out and keep using, or worse.
I think what it ultimately boils down to, it boils down to how effective regulations can be. You have to have an effective regulation, and that takes time, I think, to develop. And I think what we're learning now, as painful as it may be, whether it's with vaping or with marijuana, it may take us 20 or 30 or 40 years before we really appreciate where we went wrong and maybe how to correct it. But unfortunately, a lot of the damage, you're right, a lot of the damage may be done. There is no answer. Believe me, when he gave me this subject, I said, I don't know what I'm talking about prohibition because I don't know anything about it. Really, when you look into it, you could write, there are volumes written on the subject. And I think, well-intentioned as it was a failure. I don't think anybody would disagree with that. It was an epic failure. And what we don't want to do is to say, okay, fine, it was a failure, therefore don't regulate any vices or any ills. Do I think that the Philadelphia tax on sugary soft drinks is good? Well, it might be good for Philadelphia. And that's where the original Constitution and the Bill of Rights, Article 10, said, okay, we'll leave it up to the locals to determine what is right for them. And if Nevada said gambling was okay and prostitution is okay out there too, I understand. Never tried it, but I understand it. That's their determination. That's a local determination. The real question is when we start to incorporate that into the federal jurisdiction, we have to be very careful about doing that. Sir?
I am a lawyer, retired. I might let you get away with this.
Oh, I figured that'd be something.
You can't legislate morality. Almost all laws legislate morality. Laws against murder legislate morality. Laws against stealing legislate morality. Laws in favor of health care promote it, really think it's a good idea, et cetera, et cetera. The real question is effectiveness and what are you trying to achieve?
No, I appreciate that. You're right. Actually, I think Moses got the first shot at legislating morality when he brought the tablets down from the mountain. And that's true. It is true. And I think that I guess, you understood where I was going.
Sure,
Yeah.
absolutely.
No, but you are right. It's a slippery slope. It's a slippery slope. though.
Gotcha.
Sir?
Something that strikes me, and maybe you can speak to it, I don't know, that 30 to 40% of the federal taxation coming from alcohol, and at the same time, I forget what proportion of states he said had already banned alcohol.
They didn't ban it. They controlled it in some way.
Oh, okay.
Some of them did ban it. There were dry states. In fact, I remember Kansas, when I was out in Kansas back in the 70s, it was dry. Although you could still bring a bottle in and enjoy it. But I don't mean to say they had banned it. They regulated it strongly.
Thank you.
Sir?
Something that's not been discussed, and that is that during the Prohibition, there were many illegal acts because of Prohibition, and it boiled down to a serious group of people all over the country that became the gangsters. And during that period, they became very strong and organized. But when they repealed it, there was no place for those guys to go. So that's why we had all the gangsters during the 30s, all the gangs that existed, as we all know. And those gangs still exist today before the ancestors of those gangs that exist today go back to those years. So we started something that I don't know how we're going to stop it. That's when the big gang area in the United States started, and I don't know what, and we're going to pay for that the rest of our lives probably.
Well, I think that wherever there's an opportunity to, shall I say, cash in on some of society's weaknesses, there are people who will find ways to do that. When bootlegging no longer became as profitable, they started to move into other things like narcotics, and we have that problem today. So who knows what tomorrow's problem will be? I don't know, but we always have to be vigilant. We would hope that our legislators would be vigilant in maintaining an eye on where these traps are. And today it might be marijuana. I'm not trying to say one way or another, but I'm just saying I tend to agree that it's there is that risk that we popularize something to the point where we don't realize the damage it will do a generation from now. Sir?
I'm kind of getting into the twilight zone of liberalism versus conservatism.
Yeah, no, that's why I'm trying to avoid that.
Yeah.
I'm trying to avoid that.
I'd just like to make the following points. We have a situation in our family where my daughter's in-laws has a brother-in-law who's a policeman in Denver. And the correlation that he can make of what has happened to Denver since marijuana has been legalized and the amount of crime that they have and the policing that they have to do is a direct correlation.
Yeah, what does he tell you? Maybe you can tell
Well,
us.
the societal breakdown to the point that this lady was making over here about not respecting laws. I come from the medical side of the business. I own an advertising agency that specializes in medical advertising. San Francisco was the #1 city for medical conventions. San Francisco, Chicago, and New Orleans were the 3 most popular cities. The number of people organizations that have canceled going to San Francisco now, because they're appalled by what they see and what has gone on in that city. And a lot of this stuff doesn't get reported because the press chooses to cover that. It takes other people making us aware of the problems that are, as an example, in Denver, the rate of crime. In San Francisco, you go out there and you say, why would I ever want to come back to this place? I'm stepping over, you can imagine why. So that is a correlation there too, that it's just that, to this gentleman's point about how when we tried to crack down on marijuana, we were arresting people and putting them in jail. I have a nephew who died. He was caught with, he was a musician, and smoking marijuana is the kind of thing you do in the club when you're around, and that led to different things. He was caught with just enough that they considered him a dealer because he buys some and sells some. 5 years in the South Carolina prison. He got out, went through his reviews, and urine test, or whatever it was, the next 6 or 8 months, he was clear. Next thing he did is he went back to Charleston and he overdosed that weekend. So tragedy has hit our family, and it's just, so on one hand, you have people being put in prison for maybe there's better ways to handle the marijuana users, but on the other hand, we as a society take on all these other added expenses now, police and people sleeping on the street.
This is why I tried to say sometimes it's better that the government act a little bit more slowly than fast. Were you going to ask a
I
question?
just wanted to say, the one area in my lifetime where I've seen a huge change is smoking. It took decades, and what I recall in the beginning was on airplanes. And half the plane could smoke and half the plane couldn't. And of course, the part that couldn't was still choking on the smoke. But that really did impact the culture over time. And now you can't go anyplace, really.
One more. Anybody? I'll tell you, one of the highlights of my traveling days was during that period where they had, you had smoking and non-smoking, and I wanted non-smoking, and they said, I'm sorry, but all the non-smoking seats are gone. And I said, I'm sorry, but you know the regulation. She said, that means we have to make the whole plane non-smoking. I said, thank you very much.
Well, Peter, we're all going to go to the bar and have a drink. No, listen, there's nothing wrong with drinking. People are always recommending here, believe it or not, that we hold an Oktoberfest. Now, I know. And I have to tell you, I like to have a drink once in a while like anybody else, but I tell them, how can an organization like ours hold an Oktoberfest and have beer here? You know, they call it suds today. I'm not against any of that. There's a lot of nice, microbreweries. But I do think that, I don't know, maybe it's just me, but everything's so liberalized today. It's like, nothing matters. Let's go have a drink.
Well, it's always in the abuse.
But we do have a speaker's gift for Peter. There's nothing we can really get him because he has everything he ever wanted. He drives a 10-year-old car, I think. But 9 years old. But it is a hybrid, so he's working on that. So we have the great photograph from Iwo Jima framed here. By the way, he really is the man behind the Palmerton Historical Society. He runs the Palmerton Chamber of Commerce. Even though he's 79 years old, he works 50 hours a week, he'll never give up. That's really what keeps him young. God bless him. So let's give Peter a really nice round of applause. We got to give a round of applause for Mrs. Barney's baby when we can.
I do have some copies up here of the Constitution and also of the Palmerton Historical Society's newsletter. If you'd like to take it, feel free. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.